Well, I think probably the first thing to say and the first thing to note is that there's an increased interest in childhood generally. It's a matter of common concern. So if you look at any media form, if you pick up a newspaper, if you look at television documentaries, if you look at policy initiatives, then all of these forms have got something to say about childhood, what it is, what it should be, whether it's lost or not. These are matters of common concern. And I suppose what I would say is that features of the idea that childhood's in crisis has many different features. The first one being, well, children don't go out to play anymore. It's not what it used to be. The second one being that, well, children, they stay in their rooms all the time playing computer games. They're hooked on digital technology. They're hooked on consumerism. And as school students, they're very unhappy. They're under pressure all the time. They're constantly put under pressure to take exams. And I suppose, the clincher for the idea of childhood in crisis is the notion that children are deeply unhappy, that they're distressed, they're dissatisfied. So I suppose in all of those forms are creating that idea that childhood is in crisis. And what I'd say about that is that it's important to look behind the headlines. It's important to say, is this really the case? And if it appears to be the case for some children in some places, then why is it? And does that necessarily mean that the whole of childhood is completely in crisis? Well, I think if we're looking at the idea that childhood is in crisis, we need to look at why, and we need to be a bit more specific and try and unravel and unpack that idea. And what I would say is that there are two ways of looking at the idea that childhood is in crisis. The first way is to say, well, actually, it's not childhood that's in crisis, but actually there's a moral panic around childhood itself. This is fueled by the media. The media pick up on some themes that are out there, some discontent and some kind of feelings of regret or loss in some way, that the media picks up on it and fuels the idea that there's a crisis. So if we look at the history of moral panics and the way they relate to childhood, then what you find is in the 1950s there was a moral panic around boys reading penny dreadful comics. In the 1970s there was a crisis around young people and watching violent videos. In the 1990s there was a crisis around girls reading magazines with a high sexual content, and now we've got a crisis around generally around children's well-being. So I'd say that idea of moral panic is one way of explaining the crisis, and it's cyclical. It's whipped up by the media. It's not a real crisis, though aspects of it might appear to be true. But it's a media-generated moral panic that just picks up on some of the concerns of the time. I think the other way of looking, apart from the moral panic idea, is to say, well, it's not childhood that's in crisis, it's actually adulthood that's in crisis. So the real crisis is among adults, and it's adults' fears and anxieties that are being projected onto children. There are three trends in that respect, and I think the first one is to say that parents are a very diverse body of people. If you think, who are parents? If you take the experience of first-time motherhood, you find that many women are delaying motherhood until their 30s, so most women will be in their 30s or even early 40s, whereas a small number of women are having children early in their teens. So first-time mothers can be anything from 14 to 48. So they're not one group of people. They're a very diverse body of people, and so being a parent doesn't necessarily mean that you have something in common with other parents, and it doesn't necessarily mean that there's a consensus around parenting and parental practice. So that's the first trend that I'd say. I think the second trend is that parenting practices are increasingly under surveillance, that they're no longer private. The way you bring up your child is no longer a private matter for the family. It's actually a public concern. So parenting practices are very much under the microscope, and people feel that they can comment on them, and sometimes they can intervene in them. And I think the third trend related to that is a general kind of lack of confidence in the whole idea that parents know best. I think the Dr. Spock era, for example, his advice to parents was, as a parent, you know what's best for your child. have confidence in your own judgment. But now what we're seeing is that parents don't have that idea that they know best. They feel that parenting is something that they have to reach out for. So what we see most recently is the increase in the whole idea, professionalisation of parenting, as I like to call it, that idea of the expert. And there are a whole raft of televisual experts, the super nanny, for example, being the most famous,